Old fairy tales are in old oaks. And so are some fair folk. It's another Fair Folk Friday. So today we're going to talk about the elusive oakmen of what is now northern England and what many would say should be southern Scotland. And they're somewhat sporadically found in folklore, and a lot of the times saying somewhat contradictory things. But in all cases, they are heavily associated with, well, oak trees and live either around or in them. Generally artistically represented similar to the style of Ents, just smaller, and some would say they have a very similar attitude towards things. Now they have a variety of old names that I can't pronounce that for the most part seem to translate to either specifically oak herders or herders of the hearts of oaks, with some speculation that they're at least vaguely related to the Red Apple Men of more popular and well-known myth. They are also described as a stockish dwarvish people with red noses. At least one tale believes that they come from oak trees that have fallen and have eaten men who have tried to take the fungi off their corpse. And in other legends, they are protectors of the animals, especially ones that would be around oak trees. And while there are legends of tree women, not specifically oak women. And while this doesn't paint the most friendly of pictures, for the most part, if you are respectful of oaks and other trees, you're gonna at least be on their neutral side. Respected, feared, and in some cases, worshipped fair folk. As if we needed more reason to be wary of the forest. It's another Fair Folk Friday! And again we return to the Isle of Man, the Isle of the manliest men. The Hogmen, as the name implies, are humanoid Fairishim with the features of, well, hogs. They are also called the Hillmen because they often resided in caves, in hills, and generally roamed about very hilly areas. And they are one of the most feared of the Fairishim, the Manx Fairfolk. Not necessarily because of their power, but their frequency of the capability of seeing them, because it was possible that you could see them at night, and they would be particularly vicious towards humans. Especially so on November 11th, which was, excuse my pronunciation, but the date of a festival called Lunantashi, which was a festival of honor of spirits that protected blackthorn plants, which is a plant that is very important to Farishin. But this day was also called Hollantide. And Hollantide is the name to use specifically to refer to the fact that the different tribes of hogmen would basically change which hills they dwelled on. So effectively they would be moving houses, and there was even more chance of running into these ferocious creatures. Luckily, according to legend, you can ward them off by giving them fruit. It's another Fair Folk Friday. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about Man McMahon, the giant of Cork County. So there's a lot of stories about Man McMahon, and it kind of depends on exactly how he interacts with you, is how you feel about him. Much is the case of many she and she-like creatures in Ireland. Because he is, as the description gives him, as the giant of Cork County, a giant in a very literal sense, in the sense that a normal human can fit in the palm of his hand. And he has acted as a protector, he has been an adversary to the people of Ireland, and, specifically in and around Cork County, and has even been an intermediary in some legends. He lives in a seaside castle, where he keeps a lot of the elderly giants. And to help him, he often steals children, mostly boys, though there are some legends of girls being taken, and it seems that whenever they're took, they seem to be around 7 years old. Now, granted, in these legends, he's not unfair to these children. They are well-fed, well taken care of, well-clothed, but however, they are most certainly his, and and many of his legends have to deal with him basically having tasks for people to perform to get the children home. In one case, there was a man who only could identify the child because of a dream, and he had to point him out, and all of the children, even though years had passed since the child's disappearance, appeared to be 7 years old and looked incredibly similar, and pretty much the only way that this person was able to identify the child was to make the children laugh so that he could particularly point out the child that he was looking for. And Man McMahon, in this sense, is much in the same way as many other She, Fae, fairies, Irish cryptids, however you want to define them. They're working on a completely different set of moral values in a completely different society than humans. But they have laws and rules for which to accommodate us. Welcome to another Fair Folk Friday, and today we're going to talk about Tommy Rawhead. Keep away from the marl pit, or Rawhide and Bloody Bones will have you. Tommy Rawhide, or Rawhead and Bloody Bones, sometimes just called Bloody Bones or Old Bloody Bones, is a boogeyman figure around the area of Lancashire and Yorkshire. Sometimes referred to as a water demon, at other times a member of the fair folk who is very malicious towards children. Oftentimes children who do ill deeds or say bad words, who could be found in either the marl pits or the various ponds, and drag such children down for some unknown reason, presumably eating them. And folklorist Ruth Tongue specifically says that he has two informants that can hide in dark cupboards or far more often under stairs. And they then pass on that information to Tommy Rawhide so he may choose his victims. If you were heroic enough to peep through a crack, you would get a glimpse of the dreadful creature with blood running down his face, seated waiting on a pile of raw bones that had once belonged to children who told lies or said bad words. If you peeped through the keyhole at him, he got you anyway. And as I said, this figure is associated mostly with Lancashire and Yorkshire, but there seem to be a variety of versions, including a Cornish version of a ghost of a man that was from Baldoon. And I am also familiar with an American version of this tale, but it goes a little differently, and it kind of depends if you're getting from a Celtic American versus an African American. But both versions do have the similar feature of Rawhead and Bloody Bones being two separate characters, or at the very least, two different parts of the same monster. Mostly what's different seems to be the context, because in a lot of the stories that are African American, it is specifically tied to certain slave narratives. But a lot of the stories, regardless of the origin, do seem to revolve around that there is a reason it's coming after you, including a story of a gossip losing its head because of, well, the gossip they spread. Whether fair folk, spectre, or ghost, this is a very interesting piece of folklore wherever you hear it from. Yesterday was very busy for me, but today is another Fair Folk Friday. And today is a request from a friend of mine because we're going to talk about corgis. Specifically, the breed of corgis that is generally called the Welsh Pembroke corgi. There is also the Cardigan Welsh corgi, but for the most part, any legends that have to do with the fair folk are specifically talking about the Pembroke breed. There's a couple different variations to the legend, but in almost all of them, the corgis used to belong and existed in the same realm as the Tylwyth Teg, the Welsh fair folk, specifically as steeds. So I am by no means an expert in the Welsh language, but from multiple sources, the word cor means dog, meanwhile gi is in reference to dwarves, so even the name means dog of the dwarves, or probably closer to the translation, as it's intended, is dog of the wee folk. And in the majority of legends, were originally gifted to humans as a gift to children. In one legend, two farmers' children had happened upon a Tylwyth Teg funeral, and they were gifted the dogs of the person whose funeral they were attending. The children were told that the dogs were warriors in their own right, but could still help with menial tasks and such. And the small size of the corgis made it so that they were unlikely to get kicked by either cows or horses. That, mixed with their highly energetic nature, made them really good herding dogs. In another variation of the legend, the king and queen of the wee folk were traveling on their steeds. However, something happened in which the king was knocked off and his steed kept going, and his queen went off her steed to go help the king, and her steed kept going. The dogs oblivious that anything had happened to their owners. By the time the king had recovered, and they had found their steeds were playing with local children. The king and queen felt that they couldn't separate the children from the dogs, and decided that they would just get new steeds. This legend also being one of the reasons why corgis have an association with royalty. Seems even mundane things like our short-legged little friends here have fantastical origins. It's another Fair Folk Friday, and today we're going to talk about the Plant Herace Throven. These fair folk are believed to be from Wales, specifically on an island west of what is now Pembrokeshire, but it's a land that disappears and is often invisible. It being believed that, at least with human eyes, there is only a specific point of which the location is not entirely known and it keeps getting lost. Humans cannot seem to remember where the exact point is, but if you stand on this point and you look out, you'll be able to see the island, but if you move from it, it goes back to being invisible. Not many descriptions are given of what the people of this island look like, just that they are incredibly handsome, though they are said to be extremely short in stature in comparison with other Welsh fair folk. Which is funny to me, because it's a common stereotype that Welsh people are short as it is. And these short kings and queens are known to produce a certain type of magical herb that, depending on the story, it changes either the name or the purpose of the herb, but these fair folk are the ones who grow, keep it, and every so often allow it to wash up on Welsh shores. It's interesting to note that the name Plant Herace Throven basically means the clan of Herace Throven, which means Herace the Deep, in this case deep meaning wise. Putting that in most stories, that this island is effectively its own kingdom, claiming descent from a chieftain of decent renown. This is somewhat backed by that there is a similar Manx tale of these creatures, and they call them the Clone Miorni, excuse my pronunciation there, which effectively translates to the Proud Tribe. And if you ever visit the island, it is said that for the most part, there is a tradition of treating strangers that as long as they act right, that the inhabitants will treat the strangers as they would their own mother, which is to say, very kindly. Though, of course, the tales of these creatures vary, and the exact rules in which the strangers have to abide by might also not be what many humans are used to. Thank you all for watching. A reminder to young men who are perhaps overwhelmed, be it Anku Dullahan or the devil himself. Death has no tail. A total solar eclipse is upon us on the 8th, and it reminded me of a tale that my grandfather told me when I was a very wee lad. The Sidhe are often described as mysterious, and while I do say that people, I think, overestimate dangers in particular, it's not to say that you shouldn't be careful. For there are certain Sidhe that even their own kind prevent how often they can come out and play. One of which my grandfather called tailed reapers. According to my grandfather, one should never be alone during an eclipse, because accidents have a tendency to happen, and especially during an eclipse, it is possible that even if you survive, you're in a state of confusion where you might think you're dead. And the tailed reapers are fair folk who will take advantage of this and will appear, vaguely humanoid, their features hidden in black robes, and will seem to silently shepherd you towards a light. But upon reaching the other side of that light, you realize that the black robes are made of skin, and the color black is from dried blood. The skin and blood of previous victims. And the way my grandfather told me this story is that the previous victims are not always human, and sometimes are other fair folk. And were apparently so effective at this that the other fair folk, even with their, various politicking and wars of their own kind, banded together and bound them. But, for whatever reason, the magic does not work during eclipses. Of course, eclipses are the ultimate representation of light returning to the world. So there is cause to celebrate. But be careful how much you celebrate, and get home safe. It's another Fairfolk Friday, and today we're going to talk about Melusine, who you may recognize as the Starbucks logo. Melusine is a primarily French fairfolk with some variations in England, Scotland, and a lot of its lore specifically connects to Arthurian lore, so arguably Wales and Cornwall. So depending on the source, Melusine is a partially fairfolk creature, in the sense that she also has human parentage, and depending on the iteration, artwork, literature, etc., either has the bottom half of a snake or a mermaid. And her story actually starts with her parents, as her mother, Pressine, was a fairfolk from Avalon. That's the connection to Arthurian lore. Who once met a lord who was in need of a second wife, and asked Pressine, her mother, to marry him, and she accepted on the condition that he was not to see her during childbirth. This was accepted, and Pressine gave birth to triplets, of which Melusine was one of them, and unfortunately, in a moment of joy, her father forgot about this and rushed in to see as one of the children were coming out, seeing his wife in her true form, breaking the promise, which forced Pressine and the children to return to Avalon to live. Pressine would often, accompany her children to a hilltop where they could see their father's realm. When the girls were 16, Melusine got the idea to want to torture her father because she knew that her father was a source of pain for her mother. So they captured him and they imprisoned him in the mountain that they often went to see his lands. This angered Melusine's mother because the source of pain was more that she genuinely loved the man and knew the man loved him back, but fake contracts. And so all of the girls were variably punished, but Melusine specifically was banished from Avalon, and every Saturday would take either her mermaid or her half-serpentine form. And she herself would eventually get proposed to, and had a very similar arrangement as her own parents, in that she must be left alone on Saturdays. And eventually, this was accepted, and they had a happy life together, and they had 10 kids. These 10 kids eventually kind of formed their own various royal houses. Most prominently, the House of Lusignan, who have a mermaid both as their crest and dragons as their supporters. That's going to come in later. Both of those are imagery associated with this legend. And House Anjou, which I might be mispronouncing, which is one of the houses that House Plantagenet descends from. And yes, we are talking about those Plantagenets. So Melusine is the ancestor of quite a bit of royalty. Eventually, the husband and kids would eventually get curious, because even the kids were not allowed to see her on her Saturdays. And one day, one of her sons went investigating, found her bathing, and saw her tail, told his father, and his father confronted her about it. Depending on the version of the story, he denounces her as a false serpent, calls her a witch, believes that, like, in this form she's seeing her fey husband, which doesn't exist, or even every Saturday she's doing the horizontal tango with the devil. Breaking the contract. And so she herself is forced to leave her family. But she doesn't stay gone. She often visited her children and is said to visit her descendants in a variety of ways. Now, predominantly, mostly for prominent funerals, as well as most often the death of particular houses, or incredible changes, such as if her family is getting a new cadet branch, or some variation of that, if the lands that they owned were changing hands. Very much a lot of the death of something, whether literal or figurative, accordance to stature. Now, how she leaves her husband accusing her has two different variations, which is interesting. Which is, in one, she just jumps out the window, goes to her true form, and she swims away. In another, she transforms into a dragon. Again, I mentioned the dragon supporters earlier, and flies away. And often is in the appearance of the dragon during the events in which she returns for various reasons. But in all versions of the story, she is still banished from Avalon, and her only living desire is to be there for her descendants. I love this story and a relatively unique aspect of a motif that we see a lot in a lot of folklore and a lot of mythology, in that there is some great secret that a spouse can't know about. And in this case, it happens like twice, like one generation to the next. I hope the story was interesting to you, and thank you for watching. It's another Fairfolk Friday, and today is a tale from the West Highlands of the Headless Trunk, also called the Calún Gwn Sion. He was a Bócan, which is a type of Scottish house sprite. Now, while they would often be belligerent and even combative, they would help around the house. In this case, though, to the MacDonalds of Morar, the clan MacDonalds that resided at Morar House, their Bócan was headless. And while the Headless Trunk was very protective of the lands and the people of the MacLeod family, pretty much everyone else was fair game after the sun went down. At night, it was known for haunting the Smooth Mile, which is a pathway that leads to the Morar house, and it was not uncommon for mutilated corpses, often headless ones, to be found in the morning. One day, the victim of the Headless Trunk was a dear friend and distant cousin of the MacLeods, and specifically one MacLeod, Big John of the MacLeod clan of Rossay, specifically took umbrage. After Big John sought advice from his stepmother on what to do, he sought out to destroy the Headless Trunk. So at night, Big John himself went to the Smooth Mile, and indeed faced the Headless Trunk in a great battle that lasted until dawn. However, like many figures of Scottish lore, the Bócan was not fond of sunlight in a variety of ways, and as the light came out, Big John was able to grab the creature and push it towards the light. And while this creature was not known to speak, the Headless Trunk pleaded desperately to be let go of. Big John did not let go, and while it was not quite daybreak, light could still be shown, and he kept pushing the creature into more and more light, and the creature eventually said that he would not be seen again if he was let go. Big John took pity on the creature. "If thou swear to, on that book, on that candle, and on that black stocking, you may be gone." And he made the Headless Trunk swear on his knees. When he was released, it flew away, lamenting, "Far from me is the hill of Ben Hedderin. Far from me is the pass of Murmuring." The Headless Trunk repeated these lines, singing it even, until his voice was just a whisper in the distance. You can often hear women and children in the area still singing this lament. It's good to keep in mind that this is a Fairfolk. This was not an easy fight for Big John, which, even though you can probably guess by the name, Big John was an abnormally strong man every time that this story is told. And the fact that women and children specifically are said to sing this lament is interesting, because the Headless Trunk would not harm women or children. Whether it would defend them seems to be dependent on the source material. The Headless Trunk also only attacked people that were traveling the Smooth Mile alone. Its only recordings of attacking in groups are groups that were sent out to hunt the creature. The bodies found of the group would always be headless. I hope today's Fairfolk Friday was interesting. Thank you for watching, and remember, be vigilant.